Okay, welcome to Unit 11, Video 3. Today we are talking about the Russian Revolution. We're going to talk about Lenin a little bit about Stalin. We're going to see how they got into what they got into. So let's just jump on in. So the Russian Revolution was like a firecracker with a short fuse, just waiting to burn out. There had been cruel and oppressive czars, which had resulted in widespread social unrest. Between the time period of 1863 and 1900, the number of factories in Russia doubled. The Russian government turned to foreign investors and raised taxes in an effort to build up Russian industries. By about 1900, Russia was the fourth largest steel producer in the world. Now, although they had grown in industrialization, they were still considerably behind other nations like the United States, Great Britain, and France. There ends up being an uneven distribution of wealth. Now, this upset the landless peasants, and it turns them against the nobility. And this should remind you of another revolution that we have already studied this year. So I hope that you said the French Revolution. So if you thought that this reminded you a lot of the French Revolution, you're right. So all of this industry that's occurred is going to lead to great worker discontent. All of these new factories are going to bring about new problems like low wages, poor working conditions, even child labor. Labor unions were outlawed, and this is when we start to see several revolutionary movements pop up. Remember Karl Marx? His writings influenced many people at this point. So these revolutionaries believed that the industrial class would revolt and overthrow the czar. These workers would form the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, meaning that the workers would rule the country. Some of the other issues in Russia at this time are military defeats. So these revolutionaries would not have to wait long. But between 1904 and 1917, Russia faced a series of crises, which showed the Tsar's weakness and ultimately led to revolution. During the Russo-Japanese War, Russia broke a series of agreements that they had made with Japan, which led Japan to attack Russia in 1904. Tsar Nicholas II decided to drag Russia into World War I. Russia couldn't handle the expense of supporting their military. Its generals were weak and their troops were very poorly equipped. German machine guns would just mow down Russian soldiers by the thousands. They suffered defeat after defeat after defeat, and in less than a year, over 4 million Russian soldiers had been wounded, killed, or taken as prisoner. Again, we see this as demonstrating the Tsar's weaknesses as well as his poor leadership of the military. So we know that Tsar Nicholas is a poor leader. In 1915, he moved his headquarters to the war front. He did this hoping that he might be able to increase troop morale and turn things around to victory. While he was away, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, was in charge. As you can see here, the Tsar and his wife have 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. Their son, Alexei, he suffered from hemophilia, which is a life-threatening disease. A quote-unquote holy man named Rasputin, who seemed to have these magical healing powers, put Alexei at ease. As a way to thank him for helping her son, Tsarina Alexandra, who was running the country while Nicholas is at the front lines, she gave Rasputin a major say in government affairs. Rasputin opposed any forms, and he was any kind of reform, and he was murdered by a group of nobles in 1916. After Russian troops mutiny, a general uprising breaks out, and Tsar Nicholas II is forced to abdicate the throne. Within less than a year, the Romanov family has been abducted and brutally murdered. Their bodies were dumped into an unmarked grave, and for decades there were rumors that the youngest Romanov daughter, Anastasia, had actually managed to escape. There were several women who claimed to be Anastasia in hopes of getting the inheritance. However, DNA tests proved that none of these women were actually Anastasia. So in 1905, about 2,000 workers and their families, they approached the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They wanted to see about getting better working conditions, more personal freedom, and an elected legislature. The generals of the Russian army ordered the soldiers to fire on the protesters. Bloody Sunday results in several strikes, and violence began to spread across the country. Later that year, Tsar Nicholas reluctantly agreed to create Russia's first parliament called the Duma. And although Tsar Nicholas agreed to create the Duma, he is very hesitant to relinquish any kind of control to them, and after 10 weeks, he completely dissolved the Duma. So in 1903, Russian Marxists, they split into two groups, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks were moderates. They only wanted a few changes. The Bolsheviks were radicals and they wanted lots of change. The White Army belonged to the Mensheviks, while the Bolshevik army was called the Red Army. Now, the White Army supported the Tsar, but there was so much discord amongst them that at one point there were 3 White armies fighting against the Red Army. The Bolsheviks are led by Vladimir Ulyanov, who later adopts the last name Lenin. So this is where we start to see Vladimir Lenin come onto the scene. He has a very engaging personality and was an excellent organizer. However, he was also very ruthless. He had fled to Western Europe in the early 1900s because he was afraid of being arrested by the Tsarist regime. Russians call him the father of the revolution. Now, after Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate the throne, Lenin felt that it was finally safe for him to return to Russia. The Germans believed that Lenin and the Bolsheviks would create unrest in Russia, and that would divert Russia's war effort against Germany during World War I. Lenin's slogan, peace, bread, and land, gained widespread support and appeal. So Lenin sees this as his chance to take control. He renamed the Bolsheviks to the Communist Party. So within days of taking control, Lenin ordered that all of the farmland be distributed to the peasants. He gave control of the factories to the workers, and he signed a truce with the Germans to stop all fighting and began peace talks. In 1921, Lenin set aside his own plan for a state-controlled economy, and he moved to a small-scale version of capitalism called the New Economic Plan. Now, this was a mix of capitalist ideas with the government owning major industry. Russia begins to slowly recover. In 1922, the country was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in honor of the councils that helped launch the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin suffered from a stroke in 1922 and ends up dying due to poor health, and his body has laid in state since his death. I'm actually going to post an extra video. It will be posted on Schoology in the additional links folder in the Unit 11 folder that talks about Lenin's body laying in state. It's actually pretty interesting, so you'll want to watch that and check that out. I want you to take a minute and write down this quote by Stalin. He sounds like a fabulous guy, doesn't he? So Lenin thought Stalin was a very dangerous man and once said about him that, quote, he has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure that he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution, end quote. He's been working his way up through the Communist Party since 1922, and by 1928, Stalin is in complete control of the Communist Party. Now, Stalin was a very cold, hard, and impersonal man. He really doesn't care too much about feelings. One of his own wives, she committed suicide because he had reportedly been so nasty to her in a dinner party that she fled from the party and committed suicide. He was just that nasty of a person. So what Stalin does is he creates a totalitarian state. And what a totalitarian state is, it is when the government controls all aspects of life. It is the complete opposite of what democracy is. Okay? So how he does this? Well, what he does he wants to get rid of all the traitors. Okay, so everybody that was ever against him or had any issues with him, he wants to get rid of them. So he used terror in order to get rid of traitors. And this use of terror was called the Great Purge. He would arrest members of the Communist Party. It didn't matter if they were a worker, a farmer, anybody that he thought was a traitor, he would have them arrested. Between 1937 and 1938, there was an average of about 1,000 people a day who were executed. Like just, you're a traitor. We had reports that you're a traitor. They would pull you out of your home. They'd pull you out of your job, and they would take you out and execute you. And so this ends up accounting for over 1 million people killed. So he's really not a great guy. So one of the other things, like we mentioned a minute ago, is that you control all aspects of society. So Stalin does this by controlling all of the information, anything from the newspapers to the radio to the arts. He closed all churches throughout Russia. And he also wanted to control the information that the younger generation was getting. So what he does is he ends up controlling all of the schools from preschool all the way up through universities. He is going to close them, control them. He only wants out there, the information out there, things that make him look good, things that make him sound like a great guy, like he's doing all this great stuff for the country. So he's definitely, he's just very self-centered and looking out for himself and wants to portray himself in a positive light. He does have an economic plan. He wanted to industrialize, and the goal for him was that he wanted the economy of the Soviet Union to catch up with that of the West. So he's going to do whatever he can. He comes up with an economic plan to try and get them to industrialize and catch up to where places like other countries in Europe, Western Europe, were, even the United States. The Soviet Union was agricultural, and so Stalin wants to increase the number of factories that are there. He wanted to do this quickly. He didn't want it to take a very long time. And so he ends up building industries that would help support military buildup as well. So what he does is that he decided that the state would take control of the economy. And the way that he does this, he sets into motion the 5-year plans. And what he does with this is, like, you've got 5 years and this is your quota and you need to meet this quota, and if you don't, then there are going to be issues. You're going to have problems. So he starts this 5-year plan, sets the quota. He's trying to get this centralized economy. He ends up building technical centers, so he wants to put industries together that are related. So if you were producing parts for tractors or tanks or airplanes and ships, one factory might be making a certain part, and then a factory down the road would be making a different part. But he wants to have them all there close together so that they can all work together quickly. So because the Soviet Union was an agricultural country, his first goal was to increase the food production so that all of the workers that were moving into the cities and the industrial centers, so that they would have food to eat. Because if they have food to eat, then they're going to be able to work and do what he needs them to do. He grew grain for trade, or to trade for tools and for money. Small farms were collectivized, meaning that they were into state-owned farms. So you would take all these private farms that everybody owned on their own, and he would collect them all together and put them into one large farm. And so farm production was also set in 5-year plans. So the socialist ideal here is that all citizens would ultimately end up working for the good of the working class and not for individual gain, which you already know is the complete opposite of capitalism. So in capitalism, everybody works for themselves, everybody's trying to be successful. In the socialist here, we see where everybody's working for everybody. Think back to when we did that Hershey Kiss activity in class, and that would show you, we went through those 3 different stages. That would be an example of what socialism is, and that's what Stalin was doing here in the Soviet Union at this time.